Welcome to part 6 and the final in our series on using Battery 4. In the last video, we're going to cover the editor and the master tabs. There's a lot to get through here, a lot of parameters and settings and routing. I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as possible while still covering all of the details of each parameter. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into this. The editor page will allow you to perform destructive audio editing to your samples, add loop regions, create cells with multiple velocity sensitive samples, tune, pan, and more. Now, one of the first things that we'll notice here is that the quick access area is converted to a wave and loop editor when we're on the edit tab. This tab and the master tab are the only ones where we don't have access to this quick access view here. Within this view, we can access either the wave editor by clicking the wave icon or the loop editor by clicking the loop icon here. And just take note that the controls that we have in the center area are going to change depending on which one that we have selected. At the very bottom of the editor tab, we have the mapping editor, and we'll cover this in a moment. Let's start with the wave editor, and the first thing that I'd like to mention is the sample picker over here in the bottom right hand corner of the waveform display. This will display the name of the sample we're currently working with, and if we click the folder icon all the way to the right here, this will take us to its location within the battery browser. If we wanted to load different samples within this samples folder, we could then use the left and right arrows here. So if I go ahead and click on this folder icon, we're going to see that we are taken to where this particular sample is located in our file directory. And now that we're within this folder, I could simply click the left or right arrows here to navigate between the other samples within this folder and load those into this cell, replacing the current one that we have. Now we've only got one sample loaded into this cell, but if we have, let's take this snare for instance, we actually have two samples in here. So whenever you have more than one sample loaded into a cell, you are going to have this layer picker to the left of our sample picker. And if I were to click that down arrow, then I can choose to display either one of these, or if there were multiple samples loaded here, we could choose them from the layer picker here. And I'm going to come back to this first sample here that we're working with of the bell. So when we're working with the wave editor or the sample loop editor, we're given a display of the waveform of the sample in the cell that we have active. And we've also got this edit range window that's going to be immediately viewable here. And actually, by default, this is going to be spread throughout the whole sample. This is only moved in because I was doing some tweaking here before the tutorial. And what's most important to keep in mind about this edit range window is that when we're making use of these different functions down below, they're going to tie in directly with this edit range. So whatever portion of the sample that we have highlighted within this edit range or selected, wherever we have this positioned, these will directly affect that particular area. And that's what these are for, to work in tandem with the edit range. Now we can change the focus of this edit range by coming to either edge and then click, hold, and dragging. We can also move this range by clicking and holding on the title bar and then just moving left or right. If we wanted to return this back to the default position of the range covering the whole sample, we can just click these double arrows and then that will expand out. Actually, it will expand out to our start and end markers. And these start and end markers are just the same as what we have available on the main tab here. And one important thing to keep in mind is that when we are working with the edit range and these markers, it can get a little tricky to adjust them both at the same time. So notice that notice the mouse cursor, how this is going to change. Right now we can click, hold, and drag up to zoom in, drag down to zoom out. If we're zoomed in, we can also click, hold, and just pull to the left or right to navigate our way. This marker down below is going to give you an indication of how far you are zoomed in and also where you are as far as where you're working at with your sample. But what I'd like to talk about is paying attention You can see what the cursor looks like now, so we can make those zooming adjustments. If I want to change the range of the edit range or move these borders, I need to be sure that I see that bracket pop up there. If I have double arrows, then I'm going to be changing the start marker or the end marker. So if I click, hold, and drag here, you can see I'm changing the start marker. If I come to the edit range here, now you see we have the bracket. So if you want to adjust the edit range, be sure that you've got that bracket available. If you want to adjust the marker, all you need is these double arrows. So I can click, hold, and then drag that back out. And it's the same for the end marker. We've got that bracket. So now I'm going to bring in the edit range. And now if I have just the double arrows, we're moving the end marker. Now, if you've watched part 2 of the series, then you know that these start and end markers are basically going to control how much of the sample we're playing back. So if I were to pull this in and pull in the end marker, then we're going to be restricted. Our playback will be restricted between these two markers. I'll go ahead and trigger the cell. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. I'm actually going to pull this end marker back out. Now let's move on to the edit range and look at some of the functions that are available with it. And so everything that we have available is going to be listed on this center bar here. And the first that we have is undo, which is going to be important because these are destructive edits that we're performing. But don't worry so much about kind of destroying your original sample. Say if you're working with a sample from the Battery Factory library, what's going to happen is that if you were to make some cuts or do some drastic changes to the audio, when you save your song, it's going to ask you to save a new version. These are destructive edits, but it's stored in memory, and then when you save the song or close, it's going to ask you to choose a location to save a new version of the file so that you're not messing up your original audio samples that you've tweaked. So I hope that makes sense. These functions and edits will be destructive to your audio sample, but they will be done on a copy. Studio One or Battery will create a copy and perform these destructive edits to you, and not on the original sample. So the first item that we have available is cropping. So again, wherever we place this edit range, I'll just bring this in on a smaller portion. If I go ahead and crop, everything outside of this edit range will disappear. Okay, I'll undo. We can then we have cut, so that would just essentially cut whatever we have out. I'll undo. We have copy, paste, duplicate. So how the duplicate works is if I were to place this edit range here, it's going to take everything within this range and then duplicate it and place it directly behind. So if you take note of the waveform here, you'll see that it's going to be duplicated and placed directly behind our edit range. I'll go ahead and click that now. And you can see we have everything here has been added to our sample. I'm going to click undo. Moving on, we have normalize, so that we can normalize the audio within our edit range. We can actually silence that. So if I go ahead and click that, then we are taken to 0 dB within this edit range. I'll undo to put that back. We can then also create a fade in or out. So this could be helpful if you have any clicks or pops. If I just select this small range here, we can see the waveform is pretty visible at this point here. So if I create the waveform, the fade in, you'll see that quite clearly. Okay, so I'll undo. We could also do a fade out. Undo. This is DC correct. Reverse for reversing the audio. Let's actually give that a listen. I love reverse. So if I go ahead and trigger the cell, I'm going to select a little bit more. I'll reverse that. Let's trigger it again. Yeah. And I will just undo that. Now what do we have next here? We've got snap, and this is going to be on by default. The snap is basically going to snap the edit range to the nearest zero crossing. And what does that mean? This is basically supposed to help you eliminate clicks and pops and any distortion within your edits. So if we were to click, hold, drag up, and really zoom in here, then we will see that with snap engaged, the borders of the edit range are going to kind of jump here. And what they're doing is jumping to where the waveform is basically at zero here. So if I come down to the individual samples, then we can see that at this point we've got a zero crossing here for left and right. And so that's why it's choosing that point, because there's less likely to be any artifacts or distortions or clicks and pops at this level. So you can see how that's jumping. And that is the snap. And next we have full range and loop range. So the full, basically when we press this, it's going to play back wherever our start and end markers have been set to, that complete range there. So if I move that start marker and then press full, it's going to play from here to the end marker. Range is going to play whatever we have selected in our range here. Now this cycle range is going to keep looping this over and over again. Okay, now let's move on to the loop editor. I'm going to go ahead and click these double arrows and expand that edit range out to the full position and return the start marker back as well. And then by clicking here, we can access the loop editor. Now within the loop editor, we can set up to 4 different loops within our sample. And we can accomplish this by clicking this plus button up here. So if I go ahead and click that once, then we can see we have our first loop, and that's going to take up the whole area of the sample. I can then click and drag on the range here, as we saw before. This time we don't have that bracket that we saw in the wave editor. We just have double arrows, so it's going to be the same with the start and end markers, so just be aware of that. I'm not sure why we don't have the bracket here within the loop editor. So we've now got our first loop here, and actually I'm going to shorten that just a little bit more. And as I mentioned, we can have up to 4 of these loops, so we can click the plus button again. It's going to add a second one directly behind the first one, and I can then click, hold, and drag to adjust that range, move that forward, click the plus button again, and then we've got our third loop. Now as we've seen here, we can adjust these ranges by clicking, holding, and dragging the edges. We can also move these by grabbing the title bar wherever we'd like. And if we'd like to get rid of them, we can just click on the X in the upper right hand corner. But what exactly can we do with these loops? Can they be used for? Well, the first thing we need to take a loop at is the mode, because this is going to affect how they actually play back and how they're triggered when we're performing or recording a track. So by default, this is going to be set to release. So if I were to, on an external controller, press a pad and then hold it, it's going to start playback of the sample, and then once it gets to the first loop, it's going to loop until I release, because we've got loop 1 selected and the count is set to infinity, and it's going to be on infinity by default here. And I'm going to slow down a little bit while we're covering these loops, because it can get a little bit convoluted, and I want to be sure that I'm explaining this properly. So just bear with me here. So by default, it's on release. If we press a pad or key and hold it down, it will play, and then once we get here, it will start to repeat. And let me just go ahead and show you that to you here. So I'll go ahead and trigger the cell and hold it with my mouse. And I'm still holding with my mouse. So if I go ahead and release though, then we finish out the sample. Okay, so that's how that's going to work. And that's important to note, because if you do have, say in this instance, another 2 samples, then we're never going to get to those. as long as you're holding down the key or pad on your controller. Now the other mode that we have available is loop until end of envelope. Now what does this mean? Once we have that engaged, I'm just going to go ahead and trigger this really quickly. We kind of don't have anything here, and you need to come back to the main and let's take a look at the volume envelope, because this is what it's going to be taking into account. Even though this isn't powered on, it's still taking these settings into consideration when we have that mode selected. So if I were to power this on or just grab the hold, and that sample I think is about 6 seconds, maybe 5, 4.5. I'm going to take the hold up to, and I'm looking at the readout down there, I'm going to take the hold up to, I'll just put it at about 6 seconds, and the decay I'll move up to about about half a second. So now that we've increased these times, let me come back to the editor. When I trigger this, we've added the hold time, we've added a little bit of release. Now that gives us more time to play the whole sample through, and since we've set the mode till the end of the envelope and we've extended that time, it should play this back for as long as the envelope we have set, which was about 6 seconds. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I feel like I kind of got a little lost there, but I hope that you're following along here. Now let's take a look at the count here, because right now if I double click, I can enter in a value, and if you put in 0, that's going to set it to infinity. But if I were to enter in, say, 4, press enter to accept that, and then I select loop 2, I'll set this to 5, press enter, and then loop 3, I'll set this to 8. Now our envelope is set to about 6.5 seconds, so that may or may not be enough time to play all of these loops that we set up, but based on what you just saw, we're going to see how that behaves. Okay, and I did not set up something here, and that is that we need to come to the mode and change that to loop until end of envelope, and loop until end of envelope. Now that should correct the problem, and they should now play back for the designated amounts that we have set there. Okay, and so we don't have enough time on our envelope to play back all of the loops that we have set, so I'm going to increase the hold, just take that all the way up to 15 seconds. Come back to our editor, I'll re-trigger. Okay, so I hope you get the idea now of how we can go about working with these. And the tune, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this third, and actually I'll get rid of the second. And then the tuning, basically we can adjust this. I'll take this down. This is by semitone, I believe, and yeah, I'm sure. So I'll take this down by 4. So what this is going to do is once we get to the loop, it's going to drop that pitch down by 4 semitones. So I'll go ahead and re-trigger. Okay, and then what we have next is a crossfade. So then when we raise this up, this display is going to show by samples, by individual samples, how many we're adding. It's going to create a crossfade from the end and the beginning of this loop to smooth out any rough edges or artifacts or distortion within our loop. Our snap here is going to function in the same way as what we saw within the wave editor, and the full range and range cycle are going to function just the same way as the editor as well. Now I'm just going to come back to the wave editor, and then let's move on to the mapping editor down below. The mapping editor is going to allow you to set velocity zones for samples and manage the various samples in a cell if it contains more than one. So whenever we add a sample to a cell, its velocity range is going to be set to the maximum range of 1 to 127 by default. And we can see that represented here by this sample block. We can also see it over here to the right. The low velocity is set to 1, and then the high is set to 127. So with this default setting of 1 to 127, essentially no matter how hard or soft you press a key or pad on your external controller, you are going to trigger that sound. We can adjust this to be whatever we'd like. We can just grab the bar here, hovering at the bottom, we get that bracket and drag that up. And then as you can see over in the right, our low velocity has updated to represent the adjustments that we've made here. And we could actually double click in the low velocity. I'll put in 1 to return that back to 0. And we can see that our bar has adjusted here. In our display area, we can also adjust the tune or pitch of our selected sample. We can adjust the panning. At 0 is going to be center. We have a range. We can take that all the way to 100. Either way, that's going to be hard panning to the left or right. I'll just put that back to center. We've got volume. We've got root. We can set the root note of our sample. And then again, we've got our low and high velocity settings there. Now the last thing that we have in the editor tab is the mapping editor, or an edit menu for the mapping editor. And actually let's switch our sample for this when we've got two different samples loaded in within this cell. This second one here has a narrower range, a velocity range in which it will be triggered. And so let me just first select this snare 4. And then if I click on the down arrow here, we can add a layer. So if we'd like to add another sample, we can cut a layer. So if I go ahead and cut that, we can paste. I'm just pasting it back to where it was. What else do we have? We've got copy, so we could copy that there. I'm gonna click and select there, and I believe that should paste behind there. I'm going to select that, and we can delete that layer. I'm going to click, hold, and drag to move that back up to the front. We can stack layers left to right, and this is basically going to just ensure that each layer has an equal amount of velocity range and kind of step this up like a group of steps. So if I go ahead and stack layers, we can see if I had even more spread out throughout these other columns, then it would just rise like a group of steps or something to that effect. We then have resolve gaps and overlaps within the velocity layers of our samples. We can set velocity crossfades, and if I go ahead and select that, then we can see that our icon kind of changes there. And actually, let me expand this out. Select, okay, now we've got this dotted bar, and this is going to show us where our crossfade is going to begin. When we hover over that, we can then click and drag and adjust that crossfade range. And this is going to affect how these two different samples blend together as we move along this velocity range. And the final thing that we have here is reset all layers. If I reset that, then it's going to take these back to full velocity and get rid of any adjustments that we've made. Below the edit menu, we have trigger, and by default, when I select these, we don't hear anything. If I choose trigger, and that's trigger. Snap is going to basically say if I were to set this here and then try to adjust the top velocity of our clap, it's going to then snap these two towards each other. So any velocity bars that you're adjusting is going to snap next to the bar that's next to it. I'll go ahead and disengage that. Okay, and so that is the editor. I mean, that wasn't that much fun. There was a lot of, technical information. We're not making music here, but if you made it through, I hope you can see that there's a ton that you can do with Battery within this edit tab. And that's one of the reasons why I love Battery so much. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the Master tab. And this shouldn't take but a few minutes here, and I'm actually not even going to cover all of these modules because I've already covered. We'll take a look at the limiter really quickly, but we've already covered these other modules within part 3, I believe it was. And I'll just put a link up here in the upper right hand corner. if you'd like to learn more about those. So let's just really get through this in a few minutes here. Now the master page provides us with various routing options via 4 buses, our main out. We've got reverb and delay, which we can access by using the send knobs within our individual cell. So we've got that snare selected. If I come to the main tab of that snare, then we can see our sends. There's delay and there's our reverb. If I turn the delay all the way up and trigger that snare, we are now making use of, and I'll go ahead and turn up the reverb here too, because we're going to look at those in a second. But by using these sends, we're making use of the reverb and delay within our master tab. And then so below the buses and reverbs, as I just mentioned, we have all of the effect modules, and these can actually, as we've seen before, we can grab these handles in the upper right hand corner and rearrange these however we'd like. Now each of these 4 buses has their own discrete modules. So right now we have the master channel selected, so these are going to be specifically for the master channel. And then as I click through here, it doesn't seem like there's any change, but if I come to bus 1 here and then say take the cutoff down to, actually let me raise that up. So that's been raised up, and then if I come to bus 2, just take note of the cutoff there. That's going to change because these modules are now for bus 2. If I take that all the way down and then come to bus 3, we can see that this is its default setting. I'll come back to bus 2, okay, and I'll just put that back. Come back to bus 1, and I'll just put that one back. So just know that these modules are discrete for each bus channel as well as the master one. So that's going to give you a tremendous amount of flexibility with applying effects and routing. And I'm just going to come back to the master channel here. And how can we even go about routing our cells to these different buses? We can actually just right click on a cell up above here and then come down to the output section. And then I'll send that to bus 1. Let's come to the snare. I'll right click and I will send that to bus 2. The other option that we have is we can click, hold, and drag a cell or group of cells onto a bus. And actually, I'll select this whole bottom row by clicking on the D here. We've got those all selected. I'll click, hold, and drag them to bus 3. So now the cells are all routed to different buses. These bottom 4 are on bus 3, and if you take note up above, the display behavior is going to change a bit. So while we're on bus 3, these bottom 2 are kind of highlighted. If I come to bus 2, snare 4 is highlighted because remember I sent that to bus 2. If I come to bus 1, then bass 1 is highlighted because we sent that to bus 1. So this is just going to give you a visual clue as to what cells you've assigned to what bus. And if I come to master channel, these are all lit because the buses all go through the master, except if you don't tell them to, and we can change that, which is another option for flexibility. So if I come to bus 1 here and then right click, I can come to output, and then I can actually send this to a direct out to the Presonus console, to a channel, a separate channel. So we can send each of these individual buses to a direct out, bypassing the master here within battery. We can also rename the bus as well. And I'm actually going to just select these as a group, right click and change the output back to master, come back to our bass, and let's send that out to master, our snare out to master. So if I come to master, we're all lit. And then as I come back through these buses, you can see that these aren't changing. They're all dim, so they've all been recognized as being sent back out to the master. And of course, we've got level meters and faders for adjusting our levels of the various buses and masters. If you're getting any clipping or distortion, just keep an eye on these because these can easily go into the red, especially when you start working with some of the effects. So always keep an eye on your meters here. Now let's move on to the reverb and delay. We won't spend too much time. Most of us are familiar with these devices. Just know that the Reverb does have two different modes, and we can access those by clicking on these icons in the upper right hand corner here. There is a standard algorithmic, which is what we have selected now, and we also have a convolution mode, which we can access by clicking the icon on the left here. And we've got a power button, we've got size for adjusting the room size, and we've got high pass and low pass for adjusting the frequencies in our reverb. With the high pass, we can adjust let high frequencies pass through, and low pass we can cut the highs. We next have a convolution display, and this is going to display the convolution waveform and also allows us to choose from different presets. So if we click the right or left arrows here, then we can see that this is going to adjust our different presets. Another cool feature here with the convolution reverb is that we can actually come to the battery browser and drag wave files and drop them on our convolution reverb display and use those as sources. We could also just drag wave files from our desktop as well. We next have a reverse down below, and that's just going to reverse the waveform here. And actually I want to do that real quick. Now if I go ahead and reverse that, okay, and I'll add a little bit more, and that's what our return is for. Both here and on the delay is to add more of that reverb signal. I'll do that one more time. And I'll go ahead and take that reverse off and take the return back down a little bit. And then coming back to the standard here, we have size again for the room size, a bit of pre-delay for how long it takes for the reverb to kick in, a color to adjust our sound, damping to kind of tweak the high frequencies in our reverb, a stereo, which will kind of control where our position, the listener's position in the room or concert hall, for instance. So the higher up we have this, then the more of a stereo effect we're going to have. This is going to kind of push us back in the room. And if we take this to the left, this will bring us closer to the stage. Is the best example or idea that I can give you there. Okay, and then next we have delay, and we can have this sync to the tempo by choosing any of these different note settings here: whole triplet, whole note, quarters. This is similar to many other delays, and we can adjust the feedback, the time. We've got panning for our delay, damp, and return. Now the very last item that we have is the limiter, because it's only the master tab that has the limiter module. And now limiters are mostly used for mastering, and they are similar to compression, but with a limiter it actually has an absolute restriction of levels, and this can provide a more pumpy or polished sound depending on how you use it within your songs. And we've got a power button to make that active. We've actually got this arrow for preset menu. We can choose from a few factory. Access our user. We can save a preset if we've made some adjustments and would like to use that in the future. We've got our input gain release, which is going to determine how quickly the limiter allows our signal to return back to an unprocessed level when it drops below the processing level. And then we have an output, and we also have a meter here. This is our gain reduction meter, which is going to show us the amount of reduction that's being introduced to our signal. And so that's it. I feel like I've been recording for about an hour now, so I hope it actually hasn't been that long. This just may be a 35-40 minute video after I can kind of get things squeezed down a bit. Hopefully it's not as long as I feel like it has been. I didn't look at the clock when I started. But if you made it all the way through and you've watched the other ones, that's awesome. That makes me so happy that if people may have actually watched the whole series, and I hope that you've learned a lot from it. There's so much that you can do within Battery. That's why it's one of my favorite VSTs, maybe even my most, simply because of the style of music that I do. It makes use of lots of field samples and processing acoustic sounds and doing sound design with them. Anyhow, thanks for watching. Final one. In the future, I'm going to start getting out some more of the Studio One tutorials, particularly some of the additions that have been done in 3.5, and there's still just a lot to cover within the DAW in general. And I want to cover Native Instruments Form and maybe some more Reason. So more tutorials are coming on the way. Thanks for watching.